You're listening to Sharkbone, a Las Vegas role-playing game podcast. This is episode 2. It's being recorded Monday, March 22nd, 2010. My name is Devin.
And I'm Jarvis.
And we're your hosts for today. So today we'll jump right in to the topics, since that's what we're all about. We don't have any announcements.
No, I don't like announcements. That's what blogs are for.
Yeah, we don't need to announce anything.
No.
But the one thing we will announce is our GM Garden topic for today, which is the movie Titan AE.
Titan AE. When did it come out? Do you remember?
I don't.
All right. Animated film. Lots of big-name actors doing the voice work.
Yeah, Matt Damon.
Yeah, and other big-name actors.
Other big-name actors.
We can't remember. Lots of people. Good times. Yeah.
It's one of my favorite sci-fi movies. And it's animated, which is great.
It is animated. It's a very good movie. I haven't seen it in a long time, but I have seen it several times. Just probably a year and a half at least since the last viewing.
Right. I watched it yesterday, put together some notes. One thing that I really liked about the movie was how at the very beginning they did kind of a prelude showing Kale, the main character, with his father, just to kind of establish a relationship there. And I thought that was really cool, because a lot of times when you're creating a character, you create this backstory.
Okay.
And that backstory, all it is just words. It doesn't have any connection for you. So sometimes I think maybe it would be cool if you took the opportunity, maybe 10, 15 minutes, to just sit down and actually role play.
So you'd rather see the backstory in-game?
Yes, I think so. Not to the point where it takes away from the actual game, but I think if maybe you sat down with GM just for like 10, 15 minutes and did something like that, I think that could be cool.
Did you know that every White Wolf book, every World of Darkness game, probably Exalted in their other games as well, but definitely every World of Darkness game, actually advocates the Prelude as the beginning of every character?
Yes, I have seen that in the books. I've just never actually experienced it.
Okay. You can't say that because we did it in Werewolf.
Okay.
We just happened to be playing Dread at the time.
Right.
We used a different mechanic, but we did the exact same thing.
But, using that different mechanic worked wonderfully.
It was.
Because it was very quick, very off the cuff, and, yeah.
So the way the books describe Prelude for your character is that you should take a few moments with the GM. Usually the GM will set up a scenario, and if your character is trying to avenge the death of their family, the bandits killed their village, whatever, then take a few minutes with the GM and say, okay, like the GM will usually set up the scene and say, all right, here you are. It's a normal sunny day in your village. You go out hunting, you return, and everything's on fire, and these bandits are coming in. What do you do? And usually no dice are even rolled, and it's just a way for you to give your reactions and the GM to give you more things to respond to.
Okay.
What's the word?
I don't know.
Little punchy moments of action. Decision points.
Okay.
There you go. So the GM gives you decision points, and then you as a player just say, well, I would do this. Okay, well, if you did that, this would happen. Now what do you do? Well, I do this. Okay, then this would happen. What do you do next? And you kind of develop, through a little back and forth, how your character came to set himself to the goal of avenging the death of his little bandit village. Because maybe you never held a sword in your life.
Right.
So then we get to see that cool moment in the movie, or in the story, the game, where the little farmer picks up the sword dropped by one of the bandits and decides that this is his new life. Puts down the pitchfork, picks up the sword, and that's a pretty cool moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I enjoyed seeing it in the movie, and I would like to see it more in games. I think as a GM I'm going to try and remember to do that in games I run in the future.
That's cool. And a lot of games, when you play them, the heroes are kind of already defined. Like you say, I'm going to play Indiana Jones. That's my character. I'm ready to go. And then some games, you actually start your character out as kind of a child or a nobody, and then work their way up. Some games are actually structured that way. But most games, when you sit down even to play D&D or something, you say, I have my ranger, and I do ranger things. But we don't know how you became a ranger.
Right.
Nobody was born a ranger.
And I think that's the kind of things that I would like to see added to more games.
I think it would add a lot of depth to the characters.
I think so, too. The second point that I saw in Titan AE that I really liked was racism. Or speciesism.
And you want racism in your games?
Not I don't know that I can say I want racism in my games. I don't want it to be a main focus.
Sure.
But it does inject that level of reality. In that setting,
Okay.
humans are looked down on, they're spat upon, and that was prevalent throughout the entire movie.
Yeah, from what I remember.
And I would like to see that more in games. Because take your classic fantasy setting, goblins are trash. They're the lowest of the low, yet you never see them not holding a morning star or something running at you to impale themselves on your
Yeah,
sword.
I would want to play a goblin.
Playing a goblin could be
in a
fun.
classic setting. I would want to play a goblin next to, say, the human druid and the elf ranger. That would be awesome.
Yes, it would be, especially if the other players played up that racism, looking down on you and saying you
Yeah.
are a piece of junk.
That would be fun. The other players wouldn't even necessarily have to do it because it could just, like, the entire party could get along. But then when you go into town, all of a sudden, like, okay, Mr. Goblin buddy, you know, you saved our lives 1,000,000 times. You know, nobody's a better rogue than you are, but you got to stay out here because you're not welcome in this village. So we're going to go in, we're going to buy the goods, we're going to find the next quest, but you got to stay out here and just wait.
Right.
That would be interesting.
It would be. It would be.
So how does racism make your game better? Or as a plot element?
I think it could be overdone. You'd have to do it very
Well, of
carefully.
course. So give me an example of some way where it would be really cool to include.
Now you put me on the spot.
Or not. I'm sorry.
let me
That's
see
all
if
right.
I can think of something here.
Sure.
There I go saying again. I'm making a conscious effort to try and cut those verbal tics out of my speech.
You and me both.
I heard it a lot through the first episode.
Yeah. It happens when we start out.
Yeah, it does.
All right, well, let's move on from the racism then. It's an interesting way to include a bit of realism from the regular world, and all of a sudden you say this is something that happens. It's human nature. It's species nature.
Right.
Humanity was racist against wolves for a long time, and they attributed a lot of dead livestock and everything else to wolves when wolves didn't necessarily have anything to do with it.
Right.
And now we don't have any wolves. So it's definitely a species thing as well. And to include it into a world would just add an additional step of realism or depth, complexity to the cultures that you present. So that would be kind of cool.
Yeah, I think that extra level of complexity would make things that much more enjoyable.
Yeah, maybe.
I think so.
So what else you got?
I also noted that the character of Kale seems to be a good study in role-playing with a painful past.
Okay.
Because his father left him to safeguard the Titan Project, go and hide it, and for 15 years, the character of Kale was living thinking that his father had left him. Thinking, oh, my father
That his father had
abandoned me.
abandoned him. Yes, I remember that.
Yeah. So there's one part that really struck me. He's having a drink with the character of Corso, who's convinced him to go and find the Titan. And as he's drinking, he's like, so you're really counting on me, aren't you? Corso's like, yeah, I am. He's like, well, if things don't go the way I want them to, I'll show you how much like my father I really am. I'll leave.
Oh, ouch.
And I was like, that's so cool, because how many characters have a troubled past? There's always something in the character's past that drives them to do what they're doing in
Yes.
the game. So the player being able to take that motivation from his past and actually make it into who that character is, I think that the character of Kale really shows how you can do that.
Okay. So
That's,
you have a
that's kind
troubled
of more like a
past.
player point.
Kind of. So you have a troubled past, and it bleeds out towards that character's interactions with the world and with other characters and everything else.
Exactly.
So are you just saying that you think games can improve by making a conscious effort to include that and bring it up, and instead of just saying, yes, bandits killed my family and my village, and that's why I am a fighter and go around and fight things.
Yeah.
Instead, you make it a little more in depth and say, now I hate bandits. I have a distaste for the color red because that was the flag they carried.
Right.
Things like that. And just even through some role-playing moments, you can meet the innkeeper or something, and then maybe something about the innkeeper will actually remind your fighter character of the bandits that came through his town, and he doesn't like the innkeeper. And that would be kind of interesting, because you could all of a sudden cause a little ruckus in the inn that might not have come up before.
Yeah. Yeah, those are, apart from the actual story of Titan AE, I was just pulling things that inspired me, saying, "Oh, that would be really cool to see in a game."
Sure.
Although they're not really story seeds, I think the story of Titan AE is wonderful. One of my points is, what would come next? I think it's a great spot to take over a story. You're trying to gather the human race to populate this planet, the planet Bob.
I agree.
And that would be a good place for a story, I think.
All right. Yeah. Let me say before we go into that, the one thing that I remembered when you said we were going to talk about Titan AE today was that the human race didn't have a home.
Exactly.
What happened to Earth?
The dredge destroyed it because they were afraid of what we might become with that Titan project.
All right. So it was destroyed by an alien race.
Yes.
Okay. So maybe your humans in your world, or your elves in your world, or whatever the majority of the party, or one member of the party, or whatever it is, all of a sudden they come from this culture that is displaced. They have no place to live. They have no place to call home. Like in Mass Effect, it could be the Krogans.
Okay, yeah.
They were this race that were created as these warriors, but they were artificially created, so they don't have a home. There is no Krogan planet.
Right.
They were created as warriors and as monsters, and then the war was over, and they just kind of said, "All right, we're done with you." And now the Krogans just kind of wander around as this cultureless, planetless society,
Right.
and it's pretty interesting. So I like the idea that you're human, but there are no human towns, so you're kind of unwanted wherever you go.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
How could we put something like that into like a modern setting?
Into a modern setting, you could be, say, Middle Eastern or something, and maybe something happened, and to avoid that, we'll just say you're American, and all of a sudden, if you want to take the 1980s example, all of a sudden Russia moves in, takes over America. The Cold War escalates and it gets out of control, and now America is basically a Russian province. So now you, as an American, don't want to be a Russian, so you leave.
You got to go somewhere.
So you go somewhere. So now you're an American in Mexico, or you're an American in Canada, or in Spain, or whatever, but completely displaced. You have no home to return to, and you're trying to hold American ideals. You can maybe set up a small village, or set up an inn, or something like that.
Right.
That you can set up a little waypoint, Casablanca style, that caters to Americans, and that would be pretty interesting.
It would be. It would be. Especially that the racism might come in there again.
Absolutely. We can tie them both together.
Yes, we can.
All right. So then you were saying it would be an interesting point. The end of the movie Titan AE is that the humanity finally gets a home.
Yes.
They build a new planet from scratch almost, where the humans can go live. And you said that would be an interesting point to kickstart a story.
I think it would be.
I think it would be as well. It would be interesting to say, okay, our story isn't about saving the world, as almost every role-playing game story is.
Right.
Our story is about building the world that we've already saved.
Yes.
And that's kind of cool. That's a totally different aspect. It could make for a far more political game.
It could.
Because all of a sudden you're trying to build the world, so do you build a democracy? And if you build a democracy, who moves in to try and take a stake in your world that doesn't necessarily want a democracy?
Right.
Or they want their democracy, or whatever else.
Or they want a democracy, just not you in charge.
Yeah, exactly. Do you build some kind of tyrannical ruled state or something where you set yourself up as dictator? Or what do you do? And once you build that, where you could run around when you decide how you're going to govern it, and you could run around choosing people to place in government, then you could also go around forging alliances.
Right.
To say, okay, humanity has a new home on this planet that we've just built, but now that we actually have a home and we are a culture, a power again, we have a home base, so now we have to go around and find allies and things to help us build that base and make it all the stronger. That's interesting.
Yeah. Makes sense to me.
That would be a lot of fun.
It would be. It would be fun in almost any game, I think, for the GM to say, okay, you've saved the world, and this is what's happened. What do you do now? It could even be just a kingdom.
I actually love the idea, even if the GM has no concept of where to take the game. I love an idea of saying, all right, make 18th level characters. You've just defeated the Dark Lord The world is saved. What do you do next? Because what would you do?
Yeah, what would you do?
I have no idea. What do you do next? You're an 18th level character. Do you go home and say, okay, I am now a king, and who the hell is going to try and stop me? Or do you just retire and maybe try to live a calm life, and all of a sudden the disposed Dark Lord's forces still have a grudge, and the remnants of his empire are trying to track you down and give you anything but a comfortable retirement? Who knows?
Yeah, it would definitely be an interesting game.
That would be kind of neat.
I think it would definitely be kind of sandboxy.
Yeah, an easy, very easy premise for a sandbox game.
Yeah. Did you have anything else you wanted to bring up?
About Titan AE? Not necessarily that I can think of.
We've covered all the points I had.
Cool. I think there's some stuff that people can include in their games or ideas for games they can run.
I think so.
All right.
I think we have quite a bit of material there. For our Grease Monkey segment, we're going to be looking at meanwhiles.
Meanwhile.
Now, Jarvis, you introduced me to meanwhiles. What exactly is a meanwhile?
A meanwhile is a short scene that happens aside from, sometimes to the character's knowledge, sometimes outside the character's knowledge. Basically, you have the regular story of your game. The players are a group of adventurers trying to slay the dragon, or they are a team of spies that are going out on the next espionage mission for the U.S. government or some corporation or whatever. And a meanwhile is basically a small scene or vignette that the storyteller will just kind of describe, or sometimes the players will act out. Depends on how you like to do it with your game. But it's a scene that happens basically in kind of a split screen from the regular action of the player characters. And the reason I like them is because I hate the idea that the entire world or setting of your game is on pause until the players arrive to interact with it.
Right.
I get this feeling when I play, you play like a D&D module or any sort, the gaming that we all played when we were kids, especially because we played so many video games and then our games kind of emulated them, whether we wanted to or not. So all of a sudden we heard tell of some dark force in this dungeon. And when we arrived at the dungeon, sure enough, we were there just in time to stop the demon from being summoned into this plane or something. We were always there at the dramatic moment. I like the idea that those cultists are actually working and that demon is being summoned whether the players go there or not. So I don't think it should go so far that the players always arrive too late. But I think there should be that question in the player's mind as to whether we'll get there too late. Maybe the demon will already be summoned when we get there. Maybe the cultists haven't actually moved in. We don't know. And that's kind of cool.
I like it. I like it a lot. I think it makes the story more interesting. I think it allows the players to see more of the story and make more connections, even if their characters don't have the knowledge that the players end up having from the meanwhiles. I think it makes the experience for the player better.
That's important because the players are actually the audience of the game. The players and the GM as well. They're the audience just like they're the actors. And some games will actively acknowledge that and give rules and systems and mechanics that revolve around you being an audience member as well as an actor, but most traditional games don't. But the players are still there to be entertained. So there's nothing wrong. I'll actually tell you this. The reason I started the Meanwhile concept is because I was running an Exalted game. They were running around, great epic heroes, doing good throughout the land. And the villain would show up and say, "You're heroes and you're causing trouble, so I'm here to stop you." And they would trounce him in an instant. Often he never got time to give off his villainous monologue about what his evil plan was.
And of course he has a villainous monologue.
Of course he does.
They all do.
He would have had one. But they shot him with an arrow before he had a chance. So what I started doing was between games, I would send out an email that would show a little scene of what that villain was planning to do. So that even if the characters never actually found out what the villain's plan was, the players still knew. So the players still had the whole story. And they could piece it together and they could say, "Whoa, wow, that's really cool. Yeah, my character's clueless about it, and he knew that the guy was evil, so that's why he killed him. But I had no idea he was that evil. Wow."
Right.
So it was kind of neat. I would place. Another thing that I wanted to do was actually show the villain's motivation, because I don't like to run black and white games where there's evil guys and good guys. I think the best villains are the ones that believe they're doing good. So I would... Exactly.
I agree.
So I would send out a little email describing a little scene where the villain is coming after the heroes.
All right, to continue.
Awesome. So I would edit a little scene, or introduce a little scene where the villain heard about the heroes running around, and he decided that his plan to do such and such, insert evil plot here, was threatened by their presence. So he sent some goons out. So all of a sudden the next game, when the players sat down to the table, they were attacked by the goons that the villain had sent. So the players, or the characters themselves, just knew that they were getting attacked by goons. But the players didn't necessarily know who sent them. Or the characters, I'm sorry. But the players knew. Players knew it was that guy, that villain. So then, next game, I would send out an email that said, the villain was like, oh, I sent my minions, but they didn't do the job. I guess I have to go myself now. And the players would suddenly get very excited for the next game because they were going to face off with this villain that had already tried to mess up their plan several times. And the villain would show up in all his power, and they would beat him promptly, as they did in that game. But they actually got a chance to see what his plans were and his reasons for doing what he did, and it was very, very cool. It added some realism and some depth to the story that I think a lot of games lack.
I think it also allows the players to invest a little bit more in the game because they know the players, even just not by just their name. They know, what motivates them. They know what they do when they're not on camera.
Yes.
They know, and that's very cool. And for me, that allowed me to imagine, okay, well, if this guy who I know has done this and this in the past and who acts like this, if I hear he's over there, I kind of have an idea what he's doing over there.
Okay. Give me a more concrete example, because that was a little vague.
Let's say in the Orpheus game we played.
Okay.
Which was awesome, by the way. There were characters. I'm trying to think of a name, of an exact...
allies or enemies?
Enemies, definitely.
One of the Malthians, maybe? Or perhaps just Bishop?
I think we'll go with Bishop, because he was the one that I got to know the most, I believe.
Okay.
I had seen a couple of meanwhiles involving Bishop,
even
though our
several emails and little stories.
Yeah, even though our characters had never met him before.
Yes.
So that time when he showed up, sitting in his car, waiting for his goons to run up to him, and my character ran right up to him to, I don't remember what he was trying to do, take the car away from him. I think he was going to...
You were just going to stop him from leaving, is what you were going to do.
Yeah, so me as a player, I knew that was something very bad could happen from that. I just didn't realize how bad yet.
That's all right.
But it was a lot of fun. I was excited to see what was going to happen. I knew that this guy was a bad guy. I thought I could stop him. Turns out that I had overestimated my abilities greatly.
Mm-hmm. You had to level up a little bit first.
I did. But it was great fun. Meanwhiles, I think, are a great way to present more of the story without actually having to run through boring bits.
Agreed.
Characters.
Agreed. There's one more thing I want to add about Meanwhiles that is something I've started doing lately. Instead of just writing little stories and little scenes that happen outside the character's knowledge, I've actually taken to the point of applying a rating system to some of the NPCs and the movers and shakers in the world.
Okay.
And I basically just rate them 1 to 5. I call it rank, and on their 1 to 5 rank, it's kind of like their power, but also their presence and importance in the story. So if you have Star Wars, for example, there's a lot of Ewoks on Endor,
right?
But they have no place in the story, so it doesn't really even matter how powerful they are. They're not important in, say, the first 2 Star Wars movies from the old trilogy. Then you get into the last movie, and all of a sudden, what the Ewoks doing matters a lot. Right. So even though they don't necessarily have a lot of power, they're now much more important to the story. So maybe they get a higher rank.
Okay.
And what I'll do is I made kind of a little spreadsheet, basically a table, and I'll put a link to it where you found this podcast so you guys can check it out. But I made a little table, and I have all my NPCs, I have what their ranks are, just some notes for myself about them. But then the important thing was I had their goal. So this is what they were working towards. And between games, anytime there's downtime in the story, if the characters say, we're going to take a week to fortify this small town that we've come across, or we're going to take 2 weeks to go to the library and research this new information, or we're going to take a few days off and go home and be with our kids before we come back and reunite as a party to go on our next mission. Anytime the players kind of vote for some downtime, I would just roll a few dice using the NPC's rank as kind of a bonus, or as how many dice they rolled, depending on the system. And with a good enough roll, that NPC would actually accomplish that little goal. And all of a sudden, things were happening in the world, and the world was moving on in the background, kind of aside from the characters. And it was really an interesting thing to bring it into Orpheus the way I did, which was every time you guys stopped to rest, basically, and regain some of your power, right, the NPCs, villains, allies alike.
Hopefully we won't have any more phone interruptions.
Hopefully not. So, before the phone rang, I believe I was saying something about the rolling dice for the NPC's goals basically allowed them a chance to kind of fulfill their goals and plans and plots and things like that. And it created a very cool tension mechanic, whereas the stakes were getting higher because you guys were trying to save the world before the apocalypse happened, basically.
Right.
Anytime you stopped to take a rest, anytime you stopped to regain your power, refresh your spells, all that kind of thing, anytime you stopped, it meant the NPCs were going to get an action.
Right.
So the NPCs behind the scenes could suddenly, I'm trying to build a super weapon. The player stopped to rest, and look, my super weapon is now completed. You didn't stop me in time. So now my next goal is that I'm going to find the first target for my super weapon. You guys stop and take a breath. Oh, I've chosen a target. Right. Maybe I'll blow it up. Let's see if you can stop me before that happens. And it created a very cool pacing mechanic, and I think it added a lot of tension to what was a horror suspense game. And it added a lot of depth as the whole world and the NPCs and stuff, the setting just kind of came alive.
Right.
In the backdrop, in the background behind the characters, always the primary, of course. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, I know I enjoyed it. I think also putting those NPC goals on a die roll also allows the NPCs to fail.
Yeah, and it was really interesting.
So if something goes really wrong, they've got to find another way to do their goal, or they've got to modify their goal.
Absolutely. It was fascinating as me to GM because I could write out a plot and just say, this is the way it's going to happen. This dragon is going to come in and raise an army of undead and invade this town. But maybe that dragon fails his summoning roll, and those undead never come up. So then all of a sudden, as the GM, now I'm faced with an interesting twist in my plot. So now I, as the dragon, have to think of a new way. So maybe now the dragon suddenly starts going to enemies of that nation that he wanted to invade and trying to forge an alliance with that nation, which is something the dragon was just going to do it on his own before.
Right.
But now all of a sudden the dragon has to play some politics. And that's kind of cool. I didn't see it coming.
That is cool.
And it adds some variability to my game and creates a lot of surprises for me that's really, really fun when I run a game. Because then I don't necessarily know how everything's going to turn out.
And when I GM, I like not knowing how everything's going to turn out.
Yeah, because that's kind of one of the major drawbacks of being a GM is that you lose a lot of the surprises and a lot of the suspension of disbelief and things like that the players get because you know all the background workings. But if you allow some of that to be randomized, then you get just as many surprises as they do, and it's pretty cool.
Yep, I like it. Now, we were talking before, and most of our content kind of seems to focus towards the game master. And you had said that maybe it would be cool to try and focus all this towards a player as well.
Absolutely. I don't think enough podcasts give good player advice.
I would have to agree with you, even though I've only listened to one, really.
That's all right. That's all right.
But it just seems that there's more content that could be geared towards a GM rather than a player.
Usually.
I was thinking about meanwhiles, trying to think how could a player be proactive and insert meanwhiles into a story where the GM hasn't heard of it or hasn't chosen to include meanwhiles.
Okay.
And one thing I was thinking is when in games that have a lot of equipment lists, and you always go shopping to buy improved equipment, things
All right.
like this, if the GM doesn't want to take the time to roleplay it out.
Roleplay through the shopping scene?
Yeah.
While
And
you're flipping through
I
this
know
book or that book?
Right. I usually don't like to do that because
No.
it's just crazy insane, takes a lot of time.
Yeah, and it's just so dry that you can rarely roleplay that out and make it an interesting, dramatic scene instead of just flipping through books and saying, how much does the shopkeeper say this masterwork sword is going to cost me?
Yeah.
And that's lame.
Yeah, that's really lame. But I was thinking maybe you as a player, you could just go ahead and name the shopkeeper.
Yeah, and
Name the shopkeeper, describe his family.
there are probably very few GMs that would have that kind of problem. They would have a problem with that.
I know I wouldn't.
No.
If it sounded interesting enough, I may just grab it and make them into a character that they might see again.
That would be a lot of fun. So you're saying that as a player, you could go shopping with your character and then write up or describe a little meanwhile about that shopkeeper's life?
Yeah.
That would be cool.
Yeah. In today, everyone has email.
Any NPC you come across.
Any NPC you come across. Yeah. There's no reason the player can't take control, write a story, send it to the GM.
The ferryman, the cab driver.
Right.
That would be a lot of fun. That actually happened a few times when I've run games, is the players will say talk to a cab driver and something will happen in the cab, and one of the players will use one of their magic powers, depending on what the system is, one of their vampiric abilities or one of their ghostly powers or something.
Right.
And the cab driver will have a very interesting fare that he wasn't really planning on having that day. And I've actually had a few players that will write up a little story about that cab driver going home to explain to his wife what happened, or why his cab is torn in half, or whatever the case may be. And it's always pretty neat because it adds a little interesting color to the world that wasn't there before.
Yeah, I think players taking the initiative is always a good thing.
Absolutely.
It is. It's always a good thing.
Having a little shared investment in the story goes a long way.
It does. Now, you mentioned you had a couple ideas.
I do. I think there's a couple things that you could do as a player to use meanwhiles in your game. And one of the easiest and most obvious is just describe what your character's doing during downtime.
Right.
Maybe you're playing a game where elves don't need sleep, but the wizard needs his 8 hours or else he's not going to get his spells back. So if you're playing the elf, what the heck do you do for 8 hours? Don't just hand wave it and say, okay, 8 hours are done. Let's go back to the next room in the dungeon.
Right.
Instead, describe it and show everyone at the table just a little scene of maybe your character's composing a song, or he's, singing an elf ballad or something that's one of their great heroes. And it allows you to introduce some color and some flavor to the setting that the GM probably is never going to have a problem with.
Right.
And so, yeah, just describing your actions during downtime can go a long way. If it's between missions, between quests, or even traveling, because we always hand wave moving distance in games.
Right.
So we're trying to get to Russia. So you hop a flight. But that flight to Russia takes like 16 hours or something. What the heck does your guy do for 16 hours?
Right. What do you think about the player just randomly introducing an NPC? Saying, we're walking down the road towards such and such a place, and I see this guy on the side of the road.
I love it. 100%. I absolutely love it. If he ends up being the major villain of the campaign, all the better. I play Sandbox games and usually don't have much of an idea of where I'm going with the story.
All right.
Usually I like to just throw things out there and the players will run after whatever seems most interesting at the time.
Right.
So, and then I just try and tie it all together as we go. So players introducing NPCs, he can say, we meet Frank on the road, and turns out Frank is actually the leader of a thieves guild that he's trying to create. That's awesome, because now I have a thieves guild in my game, and I know who's trying to create it, I know who's behind it, when I didn't before. And I can use that as the GM and run with it. And if he gives Frank a personality, even better, because then I don't have to decide if Frank is a nice guy, angry guy, shy guy, whatever. It's already decided for me.
And for any players who don't GMing can be a lot of work.
It absolutely can be.
So anything the player can do, anything you as players can do to kind of create more content for the world, It's less the GM has to do, and I think most GMs would thank you for it.
I think what it comes to is that even in a very traditional gaming environment, if I'm the GM and I say there's this story, we're going to kill this dragon over here, and these two nations are at war, anything you introduce as a player that doesn't have to do with the main story of the game or doesn't mess up the main story of the game, the GM could probably care less. If you say that there's a thieves guild over here, but that doesn't have to do with these two nations being at war, the GM's going to say, sure, there can be a thieves guild over there.
Right.
It doesn't mess with my story. I can still bring in all the scenes I had planned. And now there's a thieves guild over there. So I can use it later, or I can incorporate it if I want to. And that's totally cool.
Yeah.
I had a couple other ideas. A very simple thing that you could do for a meanwhile as a player is you can bring up some of the NPCs in your player's life. If, say, you're trying to avenge the death of your father because he was killed by bandits or whatnot, then maybe while the wizard's resting for his 8 hours and you're on watch, trying to make sure that you don't get attacked by wild wolves or anything of the sort, maybe your barbarian sits down for a few seconds to write a letter, because he's a barbarian, he can write for some reason. He's an exceptionally intelligent barbarian.
Well, the barbarians in 4E, they're not illiterate anymore, are they?
I don't know.
So.
I have no idea.
It doesn't.
But so yes, maybe your fighter. He can sit down to write a letter to mom.
Sure.
Because mom didn't die, your dad did. He's the one you're trying to avenge. So all of a sudden you can describe and tell everybody at the table, my character, my big fighter guy, is going to sit down and write a letter to his mom, and he's going to say, yes, Mom, I'm doing well. I'm still on my mission. I'm getting closer to the head of the snake of the bandit organization that I'm trying to murder or whatnot. And,
right.
Soon my father, your husband, will be avenged, and I'll be able to come home and be your son once again. Love, Phytor the Barbarian. Whatever you want to do. And that would be a really cool little moment.
It would be. I would do that.
Yeah, and there's no reason why you can't, send a letter to that shopkeeper that you met that you really liked. Write up a little letter, send it to him, and say, hey, Mr. Shopkeeper, this +3 Masterwork sword has been whooping butt for me, and I really, really like it. So I just wanted to say that you were totally right, and it is balanced completely for my hands, and it's been doing a really good job. Actually saved my life in that tussle with the dragon. There you go. I'll let you know when I need something else.
Sure. It would be cool if the GM took the time to write back.
It would be. It would be. And that's also something, there's no reason why you can't email that out to your fellow players, like between games.
I think you should.
Just send a little snippet and say, here's the actual letter that my character wrote. And one thing that's really cool, especially in games that are more combat heavy, you don't get a lot of role-play interaction.
Right.
So to have a little letter, anything that's first person from that character shows a lot of insight into their personality that you don't necessarily get to see come out. Because you just see the fighter cut down things, and you see him try to kill bandits. And he says it was because of his dad and all this other stuff.
Right.
But now all of a sudden we have these letters that actually show what he's thinking.
You have that window into what he's actually thinking when it happens.
It's kind of like a narration in a movie.
Yeah.
When the character's narrating and you get that additional insight into their thought patterns and process. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I like it. I do think the point you mentioned that whenever, say I create a meanwhile, I should send it to everyone in the game.
Oh, yeah, everybody should see it.
Everyone's experience in the game is going to be enriched by that.
Absolutely. Whether their characters would know or not, if it's really something super secret and you're actually plotting to kill the wizard in your group, or you're trying to take out, the alpha of your werewolf pack or whatever, then maybe you only send it to a few players or something like that if you're trying to keep a little bit of inter-party intrigue. But in the vast majority of situations, send it out. And me as a player personally, I would send that out to everybody anyway. Right. And say, yes, Bob, who's playing the leader of our adventuring party, my character is going to try and kill you. Do you think you can stop me? We'll find out. That would be great.
Yes, I think it would be. I agree. Fully. 100%.
Fantastic. Was that enough about meanwhiles?
I think so.
All right.
I think we've covered everything we want to cover today.
I think so.
So we're going to wrap this up. Just remember, you can email questions and topic suggestions to us at sharkbonecast@gmail.com. And we'll see you next time.
See you next time.